In the 1990s, the world's largest seller of beef and pork decided to basically expand its empire. And the target was this massive, virtually untapped consumer market of roughly 1 billion people.
Right.
And, I mean, on paper, it looked like the ultimate corporate victory. But there was a catch. This expansion was targeting India.
Yeah, which is a massive detail to overlook.
Exactly. A nation where Hinduism is the dominant religion, meaning the cow is divine and the consumption of beef is an absolute taboo. Not to mention, millions of Muslims there strictly forbid the consumption of pork. So, I mean, it should have been the greatest, most expensive corporate disaster in the history of global trade. You do not bring a hamburger to a country that worships the cow.
You really don't. It is the ultimate paradox of global expansion. You have a business model optimized to absolute perfection in one environment, and then you just drop it into a completely alien reality, a place where your core product is not just unpopular, but, culturally offensive.
Totally offensive. But instead of failing, this company completely dismantled its own identity. They built a localized agricultural supply chain entirely from scratch. They formulated, eggless mayonnaise.
Which is wild.
Right. They designed kitchens with absolute physical separation for vegetarian prep. They executed an absolute masterclass in global strategy. And today, McDonald's is a powerhouse in India.
Which really is the perfect entry point into what we're dissecting today. Because going global, it isn't just about translating your marketing brochure into a new language or, dealing with a different currency.
Yeah, it's way deeper than that.
Exactly. It's about understanding that the very architecture of reality shifts entirely the moment you cross a border, how people think, how laws are enforced, what even constitutes a crime, and ultimately, what creates value.
Welcome to the deep dive. If you're listening right now, you are probably an MBA student looking at a map of the world and trying to figure out how to make sense of it. Specifically, getting ready to master the international business environment for your upcoming exam.
And consider this your definitive breakdown of national differences in political economy, culture, and economic development.
We've synthesized all the critical frameworks, case studies, and economic theories from your source material into one cohesive strategy. Our mission today is to take you beyond just, memorizing definitions. We're going to explore the underlying mechanisms of the global market so you can analyze any country on Earth like a seasoned executive.
To really set the stakes here, consider a multinational giant like Nestle. They don't just operate in a handful of neighboring countries. They operate in over 150 nations.
Wow, 150?
Yeah, that means their executive team isn't managing one global strategy. They are managing 150 localized adaptations. They have to navigate 150 different philosophies of government, 150 distinct court systems, and 150 completely unique cultural landscapes.
It sounds like a nightmare.
It is if you aren't prepared, because if you don't understand the rules of the local game, your capital will just vanish.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we are going to reverse engineer how a company survives in 150 countries, we need a framework. And the architecture of any nation really rests on 3 massive pillars. Think of these as the foundational code of the country.
Right.
First, you have political systems. This is the ideology. It dictates who gets to make the rules and what their core philosophy is regarding wealth and power.
Yep.
Second, you have legal systems. This is the enforcement mechanism. It dictates how those rules were actually applied to a contract and, what happens when 2 players go to war in the boardroom.
The referees, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And third, you have culture. These are the unwritten rules, the historical, religious, and linguistic bedrock that determines if the local consumer will even let you walk through the front door. It's like playing a really complex board game, right?
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, where the rules, the referee, and even the behavior of the other players completely change depending on which side of the board you sit on.
And the crucial insight here, especially if you're writing an exam essay on this, is that you cannot look at these 3 pillars in isolation. They are deeply entangled.
How so?
Well, a nation's historical culture gives birth to its political ideology. And that political ideology then writes the legal code. So if you misread one pillar, the entire analytical structure just collapses.
Okay, so let's start at the very top. Pillar number 1, the political economy. Before a company can sell a product, it has to understand how the host nation views the very concept of wealth.
Right.
Like, how is money created, who is allowed to own it, and how is it distributed? Historically, this boils down to 2 heavyweights in the arena of political economy: capitalism and socialism. Let's start with capitalism. We throw that word around constantly. But what are the actual mechanics?
The intellectual architecture for modern capitalism really crystallized back in 1776 with Adam Smith. specifically his work, The Wealth of Nations.
A classic textbook cornerstone.
Absolutely. And the entire system rests on a few core mechanisms: self-interest, private ownership, and market competition. In a purely capitalist system, the government does not own the factories, the supply chains, or the intellectual property. Private individuals do.
And the engine that drives this system is self-interest. Which, I mean, it sounds inherently selfish, but the mechanism is actually quite elegant.
It is. It's the concept of the invisible hand. If you have a purely free market, a laissez-faire system where the government essentially steps back and leaves the economy alone, businesses are forced into brutal competition to win the consumer's dollar.
Right. So if you and I both sell laptops, my self-interest dictates that I want all the market share.
Exactly.
To get it, I have to either build a significantly better laptop or figure out how to manufacture my laptop more efficiently so I can sell it to you at a lower price.
So the mechanism of price becomes this incredible information signal. It naturally weeds out inefficiency. If I waste resources building a bad product, I go bankrupt. The market just self-regulates.
Innovation is basically forced by survival. Goods and services are produced strictly based on consumer demand, not government quotas.
Precisely. And nations that lean heavily into this mechanism, places like the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, they rely on this decentralized decision-making to drive economic growth.
Okay, but let's flip the coin. If capitalism is a decentralized machine driven by individual self-interest, what is the underlying mechanism of socialism?
Well, socialism was born out of the extreme friction of the Industrial Revolution. Its modern roots trace back to Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto in 1848.
Right, the exact opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah, and the fundamental observation of socialism was that pure, unregulated capitalism was structurally designed to exploit the worker. Marx basically argued that the wealthy elite who owned the factories, the means of production, would continually drive down wages to maximize their own profits.
Creating a permanent, suffering underclass.
Exactly.
So the solution, mechanically speaking, is completely inverting the ownership structure.
Yes. If capitalism is about the individual, socialism is about the collective. The core tenet is group interest. So instead of a private billionaire owning the power grid or the railway system, those assets are collectively owned and operated by society, which, in practical terms, means they are managed by the government.
The ultimate goal isn't maximum efficiency or maximum profit, then. The goal is the elimination of the wealth gap.
Right. It's a deliberate restructuring to prevent society from splintering into the have and the have-nots. They want to replace the chaotic free market with a managed fair market.
So the central credo is the redistribution of wealth. In this system, if an enterprise generates immense value, that value shouldn't just pool at the very top. It should be heavily taxed or directly channeled back to the workers and the broader society.
And we see massive variations in how this is applied globally. You have strict communist models where state control is absolute. Historically, we saw this in the Soviet Union, and we see modern variants in North Korea and Cuba.
But it's not always authoritarian, right?
No, not at all. You have social democracies, countries like Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, Brazil, which attempt to achieve socialist goals of equality and strong safety nets, not through revolution, but through democratic elections.
Now, let's pause here. If you are an MBA student analyzing a case study for your exam, you cannot afford to have a dog in this fight. We have to look at this totally impartially.
Absolutely. You have to maintain complete neutrality.
We are just mapping out the textbook pros and cons of both systems for your exam prep. We are not taking sides. So let's look at the harsh realities of both. What is the actual tangible downside of pure capitalism when a multinational firm operates in it?
Well, the clearest advantage, as we noted, is rapid innovation and efficiency. But the systemic danger is consolidation. If left completely unchecked, capitalism inherently trends toward monopolies.
One firm just becomes so dominant that it buys up or crushes all its competitors.
Exactly. And once the competition is gone, that firm no longer has to innovate. They don't have to offer lower prices. They can charge whatever they want, and the consumer has no choice.
Right. It goes from a free market to an exploited market.
Furthermore, unbridled capitalism often devolves into what economists call crony capitalism.
Or business colludes with the government.
Precisely. This is when the winners in the market use their immense wealth to buy political influence. They lobby the government to create regulatory barriers that protect their monopoly, effectively pulling the ladder up behind them.
So unbridled capitalism is basically cutthroat. The drive for lowest cost production often leads to environmental degradation or severe labor exploitation if safety regulations aren't enforced. It's like a chaotic, high-speed, free-for-all race.
That's a great analogy.
But let me push back on the socialist side of the equation, just to keep it balanced. You mentioned that strong safety nets, social services, equal opportunity, and preventing monopolies are the massive pros of socialism. But from a strict corporate investment standpoint, doesn't a heavily socialized system just translate to massive corporate tax burdens and a bloated, slow-moving government?
That is exactly the primary textbook critique. The mechanism that creates equality can inadvertently destroy the incentive to innovate. Economists refer to this risk as social laziness.
Wait, break that down for the listener.
Mm.
How does a system literally create laziness?
It comes down to the link between effort and reward, right? In a hyper-capitalist system, if an engineer works 90 hours a week and invents a revolutionary new battery, they might become a billionaire. The personal reward for taking a massive risk is uncapped.
Okay.
But in a strictly socialist system, where industries are nationalized and wealth is aggressively redistributed, that same engineer might receive a slight bump in their state salary for the exact same invention.
Ah, I see.
Yeah. When the personal individual reward is removed, human nature dictates that fewer people will take the massive, exhausting risks required to push the boundaries of technology. Individuality and personal reward get suppressed in favor of collective stability. It's kind of like...
It's like a strictly graded group project.
Exactly.
Where one person does all the work, but everyone gets a B.
Yes, perfect analogy for the exam.
So you have this spectrum. On one end, a cutthroat innovation engine. On the other end, a highly secure, heavily taxed safety net.
But let me challenge this entire framework. We are talking in absolutes. Does any modern economy actually operate purely on one extreme or the other?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, no. And this is a critical point for your exam analysis. The reality of international business is navigating mixed economies.
Because no one is purely one thing.
Exactly. The text concludes that a careful balance is needed. Every successful society eventually realizes they need a blend of the private and public sectors. You need a system that rewards hard work, the capitalist engine for wealth generation, while providing compassionate safety nets, the socialist oversight, to prevent monopolies and protect the vulnerable.
Which perfectly transitions us into Section 2. Measuring the political impact on business. Because knowing the ideology is one thing, right? It's great for a philosophy paper. But how do we tangibly measure a political system's impact on a business trying to enter that country?
Right. If you're sinking $2 billion into a factory, you need quantifiable data. Exactly. And you measure that impact through highly specific, internationally recognized indices. If you are preparing to analyze any global market, there are 3 distinct metrics you must understand deeply. The first evaluates political stability. The second evaluates bureaucratic friction. And the third evaluates intellectual property security.
Let's start with the political stability metric, the democracy index. But right away, we have to clarify a major misconception. People constantly use the words democracy and freedom as if they are the exact same thing.
But functionally, they aren't, are they?
No, they really aren't. Freedom is a philosophical ideal, the ability to act, speak, and engage in commerce without unjust restriction. Democracy is simply the mechanical set of institutions designed to protect that freedom.
So just because a country claims to have democratic institutions doesn't mean they actually function to protect freedom.
Exactly, which is why the Economist Intelligence Unit created the Democracy Index. And this is a huge exam data point. They use 60 indicators across 5 major groups to evaluate countries.
Let's walk through those 5 groups, because each one represents a specific risk to a multinational corporation.
Okay, Group 1 is the electoral process and pluralism. Are the elections genuinely free, fair, and transparent? Group 2 is civil liberties. Is there freedom of the press? Can citizens assemble and protest without violent state suppression?
Let me stop you there, because a student might ask, why does a foreign laptop manufacturer care about freedom of the press in their host country? Like, why is that a business metric?
It's a great question, because a free press is the ultimate mechanism for exposing corruption. If you are a foreign investor, you want a local press that can investigate and expose corrupt local officials or supply chain monopolies. If the state controls the media, you have no way of knowing if the local partners you are forced to work with are actually solvent or if they're just politically protected shells.
That makes perfect sense. Transparency reduces financial risk. Okay, what's Group 3?
Functioning of government. This is massive. It asks, does the government actually have the authority to implement its policies, or is it secretly controlled by the military or religious councils? And crucially, do political parties hand over power peacefully?
If you are building a factory that takes a decade to reach profitability, a peaceful transfer of power is the single most important metric. If a lost election results in a military coup, your assets might be nationalized overnight.
Exactly.
So that's 3. What are the last 2?
Group 4 is political participation. Are citizens actually engaged, or is there massive voter apathy? And Group 5 is political culture. Do the citizens actually believe in democratic principles, or is there an underlying desire for a strongman dictator to just take over and enforce order?
So they aggregate all these data points and rank the countries, and you end up with a scale. At the very top, scoring a 9.93, you have a full democracy like Norway. At the absolute bottom, scoring a 1.08, you have an authoritarian regime like North Korea. And then you have countries in the middle. India, for example, often scores around a 7.74, classifying it as a flawed democracy.
Right.
Okay, so the democracy index tells us that the country is politically stable. But stability doesn't automatically mean it's easy to run a business. A government can be perfectly democratic and peacefully transfer power every 4 years, but still have a bureaucracy so dense that it strangles you.
Which brings us to the World Bank's Doing Business report. While the Democracy Index looks at the macro-political climate, the Doing Business report measures the street-level friction. It quantifies the absolute nightmare of bureaucracy.
It highlights 11 key regulatory areas that dictate the day-to-day survival of small and medium enterprises. Things like registering property, enforcing contracts, and getting electricity.
And let's look at getting electricity to explain the mechanism. It sounds trivial.
Yeah, you just plug it in.
But imagine you just spent $50 million building a high-tech manufacturing facility. You are ready to produce. But the local regulatory board requires 18 different permits, environmental studies, and local union approvals just to connect your factory to the municipal power grid.
And suddenly, your $50 million asset is sitting dark for 6 months, bleeding cash, while you wait for a local bureaucrat to stamp a piece of paper. The Doing Business report quantifies exactly how long that takes. It tells you the hidden cost of time.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's 2 metrics, which leads us to the third, the Special 301 report. This is all about intellectual property.
Published annually by the USTR, the United States Trade Representative. Its sole purpose is to identify countries that fail to provide adequate and effective protection for intellectual property rights, patents, copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets.
Why is this a distinct, standalone report? Why is IP so crucial?
Because in the modern global economy, a company's most valuable asset usually isn't its physical factory. It's the algorithm, the pharmaceutical formula, or the software architecture. If you expand into a country with weak IP laws, local competitors can simply reverse engineer your product, manufacture it using cheaper local labor, and undercut you in your own host market.
And the government there will do nothing to stop it.
Worse, sometimes local regulations require forced technology transfers, where you legally have to hand over your source code to a local partner just to do business.
Ouch.
Yeah. So the USTR takes countries that engage in these practices and places them on a priority watch list. Being on this list hurts their foreign trade opportunities because it's a massive flashing red light to global investors.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. I am looking at all these metrics, and I have to point out an apparent contradiction in the text. The underlying premise here is that established democracies with low bureaucratic friction and strong IP laws are the safest bets for new businesses.
That is the established economic theory, yes.
Then how do we explain China? If we apply these metrics, China has historically operated an authoritarian regime with massive state intervention, limited individual rights, and notorious historical issues with IP protection. By the rules we just established, capital should flee. Yet for decades, they have attracted unprecedented levels of private investment. What is the mechanism that breaks the rule?
It is a phenomenal question, and the text unpacks this beautifully. The mechanism is something the Chinese government explicitly defines as a socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics.
Okay, explain how that decoupling actually works on the ground.
Typically, authoritarian regimes strangle business because the state controls all the resources. But China managed to balance state intervention alongside private investment. They maintained an iron grip on political power, but within specific zones, they allowed fierce market competition and welcomed foreign capital.
So they basically created these protective bubbles.
Precisely. Look at the internet sector. The Chinese government maintains strict control of internet services, a highly restrictive digital firewall.
Which on the Democracy Index is a massive violation of civil liberties.
Correct. But look at the business impact. Because Google and Facebook refused to comply fully with these censorship laws, they were restricted from the market. That strict government control created a protective bubble that allowed domestic companies to thrive. Because of this state-sponsored protection, the Chinese search engine Baidu was able to capture roughly 73% of local revenue.
Oh, wow. So the state's authoritarian control actually served as the ultimate competitive moat for a domestic business. They proved that if the consumer market is large enough, foreign companies will overlook poor democracy index scores just to get a piece of the action.
Which is why, as an analyst, you can never rely blindly on one metric.
All right, before we move to Section 3, here's a quick memory aid for the listener. Write this down for your exam. Democracy index equals quality of government. Doing business report equals ease of operations. Special 301 equals protection of ideas. Quality, ease, protection.
That's a great way to memorize it.
Let's shift the map now to Section 3, navigating the legal labyrinth. We've established how political systems create the rules. But the legal system is how those rules are enforced. When a business crosses a border, the entire mechanism for resolving disputes changes.
Right. According to Black's Law Dictionary, a legal system is the complex web of constitutions, legislation, bylaws, and traditional practices that uphold order.
But for an executive, you need to understand that there are three major types of legal systems. And you should note that hybrids do exist. But the three main ones are common law, civil law, and religious law. Let's break these apart. Let's start with common law.
Common law is described as an uncodified system. It's based on judges, courts, and tradition. In a common law system, judges hold the authority to make decisions based on precedent. They look at how similar cases were decided in the past.
I always visualize common law like a sports referee. When a complex play happens on the field, they don't just read the rule book verbatim. They make calls based on how previous games were officiated. They apply the history of the game to the current reality.
That's a really good analogy. And because of this flexibility, business contracts in common law countries tend to be incredibly long and exhaustively detailed to remove any ambiguity for the judge.
Okay, now contrast that with civil law.
Civil law is exactly the opposite. It is codified. It relies on comprehensive legal codes that specify all matters and exact punishments for offenses. The judge just applies the written code.
So using the referee analogy, civil law is like a referee who stops the game, ignores how previous games were played, and consults a massive rigid rule book for every single play.
Yes, and because everything is already in the national code, business contracts in civil law countries are often much shorter.
And then there's the third system, religious law or theocratic law.
This is where the legal system is based on religious guidelines. The most prominent example governing commerce today is Sharia in Islam.
And we will dive much deeper into the economic mechanics of Islamic law when we get to the culture section. But from a high-level view, why does a company care about this? Why does the efficiency of the legal system matter?
Because a sluggish or biased judicial system actively repels foreign investment. If you can't enforce a contract, your business is dead.
And the textbook highlights a very specific example of this. The state of West Bengal in India.
Yes, economic historians point to West Bengal to illustrate what happens when the legal mechanism fails to enforce order. Historically, businesses operating there suffered heavily due to excessive bans and hurdles.
Let's define those for the exam. What exactly is a ban or a hurdle?
They are essentially massive strikes and public shutdowns, often enforced aggressively by political groups or labor unions. They paralyzed transportation and factory operations.
And the critical failure here was the lack of law enforcement, right?
Exactly. The judicial and law enforcement mechanisms lacked the mandate to enforce basic law in order to keep commerce moving. If a union blockades your factory gates, and you cannot go to a judge to get a swift injunction to clear the road, your business bleeds to death.
Your inventory just rots on the loading dock. Capital flees. It just shows that politics creates the rules, but if the legal system can't enforce them, the market breaks.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have now mapped out the political and legal frameworks. But what about the unwritten rules? This brings us to Section 4, the cultural compass. Culture is often the most invisible yet challenging barrier for international firms.
It is uniquely dangerous because it's invisible. You can hire lawyers to navigate the civil code, but if you misread the cultural bedrock of a society, the consumers will just completely ignore you.
Let's look at the definitions. The source synthesizes definitions from several major thinkers: Tyler, Namenworth and Weber, Hofstede, and Hill.
It's helpful to see how it evolved. Tyler defined it broadly as a complex whole of knowledge, belief, art, morals, and custom. Namenworth and Weber narrowed it to a system of ideas constituting a design for living. Hofstede argued that core values are the building blocks.
And then Hill synthesizes this into the definitive business definition. He states that culture is a system of values and norms that are shared among a group of people and that, when taken together, constitute a design for living.
And here's a key concept for your exams. You must understand the difference between values and norms.
Break that down.
Values are societal attitudes toward abstract ideas. How a society views freedom, justice, marriage, loyalty. You cannot see a value. Norms, on the other hand, are the actual rules and regulations controlling behavior. They are the external manifestations of the values.
So the value is the invisible belief, and the norm is the tangible rule.
Exactly. And another crucial point for the exam, equating culture solely with a nation is a massive trap.
Right. Borders on a map don't dictate belief.
The text identifies multiple levels of culture. You have national cultures, sure, but then you have regional subcultures.
Like North versus South India or the East versus West Coast in the U.S.
Exactly. Then you have subcultures based on ethnicity or religion. And finally, organizational cultures.
Oh, like a company's internal culture.
Yes, like Apple or Google's preference for highly educated, innovative personalities versus a local traditional firm that values strict hierarchy.
This all sounds very theoretical until you try to sell a product. Let's bring this to life with an exam must-know case study. Let's go back to McDonald's entering India in the 1990s.
The perfect crucible.
The problem was that McDonald's, the world's largest seller of beef and pork, entered India, where Hindus consider cows divine, making beef taboo, and Muslims do not eat pork. That is a massive clash of values and norms.
And the adaptation was phenomenal. They successfully pivoted to chicken, mutton, and vegetarian options.
But what's fascinating here is that this adaptation wasn't just a menu change.
No, it was a profound demonstration of positive cultural signaling. It proved the firm respected local values and norms, ultimately building trust. They physically separated the vegetarian prep areas. They show the consumer, we respect your ancient norms.
Which is how you survive. But how do you know what those values are in the first place? This leads us to Section 5, Deep Roots. To truly grasp a culture's values and norms, we have to dig into the historical bedrock that formed them: religion and language.
Religion fundamentally shapes economic behavior. Let's look at the 4 major religions discussed in the text.
Starting with Christianity, specifically Protestantism.
Sociologists point to a deep connection between the Protestant ethic and the emergence of modern capitalism in Western Europe and the U.S. It focuses on hard work, individualism, and wealth accumulation.
The religious value of individual labor directly tied into the economic value of free enterprise.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with Islam. The foundational economic principle is that property is owned by Allah. Humans are just trustees.
Which fundamentally changes ownership.
Yes. Profits are valid, but exploitation and earning interest are strictly forbidden.
Earning interest is forbidden. How does Islamic banking even work then?
They use alternatives. 2 primary models are Mudarba and Mudarbaha. In Mudarba, the bank takes a profit share. They provide the capital, the entrepreneur provides the labor, and they share the risk and the profit.
So what does this all mean for the other model, Murabaha? I want to clarify this for the MBA listener.
In Murbaha, the bank buys equipment and sells it to the business at a markup.
So it's basically like a rent-to-own equipment financing model. It completely bypasses traditional interest rates while still allowing the bank to make money on the markup.
That's exactly right.
What about Hinduism?
Hinduism focuses on spiritual achievement, dharma, karma, nirvana over material wealth. And the text notes that historically, the caste system limited entrepreneurial opportunities and economic development because it restricted labor mobility.
And Buddhism?
Buddhism has a similar spiritual focus, but the absence of a caste system provides much better entrepreneurial mobility.
It's incredible how religion shapes the labor market. But the other half of culture is language. Spoken versus unspoken, or symbolic language. Language is the ultimate vehicle for culture.
Absolutely. And linguistic boundaries are often the deepest fault lines for subcultures and conflict. Look at Switzerland's tension between French and German speakers, or India's distinct Dravidian languages in the south versus the Indo-Aryan languages in the north.
Which brings up a business necessity. Expanding into hubs like China and Japan is nearly impossible without speaking the local language, right?
Yes. It grants a deeper understanding of their entire socioeconomic structure. Unspoken language gestures, pacing is critical in these high-context cultures.
Okay, we are in the home stretch. Section 6, Culture versus Globalization. convergence or collision? As international businesses spread across the globe, are we moving toward one massive homogenized global culture, or are cultures fighting back?
Well, first, traditional cultures can pose economic barriers. The text cites examples of gender discrimination like low female literacy in developing nations or limited corporate roles for women in 1960s or modern Russia. Also, India's dowry system, caste limitations, and communalism in multi-religious societies.
These ancient norms actively restrict economic potential. But on the flip side, the spread of globalization is leading to homogenization.
Yes, what sociologists call Coca-colonization and McDonaldization. Hollywood blockbusters like Terminator and Titanic are westernizing global tastes.
But this homogenization sparks a massive pushback. People fear losing their cultural diversity. It has led to literal attacks on international chains like KFC and McDonald's in places like France and India.
Which brings us to the analysis by Hill in 2009. Hill argues that globalization drives industrialization and urbanization. And when people move to modern cities, it inherently makes them less dependent on traditional norms.
So as countries get richer, there's a measurable shift.
Yes, a shift from traditional survival values to secular, rational well-being values.
Which begs the question for the listener to ponder. Is globalization destroying culture? Or is it just creating a shared business operating system while local identities remain intact underneath?
It's the defining tension of modern business.
Let's do a rapid-fire summary for the exam. Political systems dictate the rules of the market. Legal systems determine how you fight your battles. And culture determines if the consumer will even let you in the door.
Perfect recap. And I want to leave the listener with a final provocative thought to mull over for their exam essays. Building on Hill's theory that rising wealth shifts societies towards secular rational values. If globalization inevitably makes nations wealthier over the next century, will cultural differences eventually fade away entirely? Will the expensive process of local adaptation like McDonald's in India become totally obsolete for future international businesses?
That is a staggering thought. Imagine a world where you just run one identical strategy everywhere. Well, we aren't there yet, but you now have the tools to analyze any global market like an expert. Best of luck on your international business exam, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.